This is a new set of videos for the Cateran Society online program. These videos are meant to help you work through the curriculum for Level 1, Level 2, Level 3, and to a lesser extent Level 4 of the Cateran Society online apprenticeship program. I want to talk a little bit about why I've made the changes to the lessons that I've made. Um, the main reason, like any martial arts instructor, I rethink how I want to structure the curriculum from time to time. I'll have a curriculum that works to some extent for a while, and then I'll be looking at it and I'll see certain weaknesses. I'll see things I want to improve. And eventually I'll start teaching my own students differently. And then once I'm comfortable with the new curriculum, then I'll want to change the online program as well so that it stays up to date and has the best new information as I now understand it. In this case, the update is a little later than it should have been, and the reason for that is because I've been going to college for the past few years at State University in New York, their online program, which is called Empire State College. And I was too busy while I was in college to be putting together a video curriculum. So while I was in college, I did publish the most recent book, Lessons of the Broadsword Masters. And I did put the new structure of the lessons in that book. But the members of the online program didn't really adopt the new lessons, and I realized that this is because they didn't have them on video, so they couldn't see what to do, and so it was easier for them to stick with the old video lessons. And I realized at that point that I wouldn't be able to make any more updates to the curriculum unless I recorded new lessons. But I wasn't able to do it till I finished college. So the version of the curriculum that you're going to see in these videos is the version that I've been teaching to my own students for the past 3 or 4 years now, maybe even a little bit longer than that. Um, so the order of lessons is different. So I want to talk about why the lessons are in the order they are in. And the reason for that is when I was working on Lessons of the Broadsword Masters, I categorized every single technique in all of the manuals that we use as sources in the Cateran Society. And I categorized them into different types of techniques. For example, if a particular lesson showed just plain cuts and guards, I considered that a plain playing lesson because that's what Thomas Page uses that term for in his manual. If a lesson was based on feints, I considered it a feint lesson. If I was lesson was based on timing, I considered it a timing lesson, and so forth and so on. So I organized them into categories, and I came up with 10 categories because everything in the Cateran Society curriculum is organized into sets of 10 just for ease of memorization more than anything else. And having done that, I then had to decide what order the lesson should go in. And the basic principle that I wanted to follow was from most simple and most common to least simple and least common. So, for example, plain playing is the simplest thing you can do, and it's also the far majority of actual touches. The majority of actual touches that happen in real bouts, and presumably also in real sword fights with sharp swords, is just one person hits the other person, or possibly does a parry and then a riposte and then hits the other person, and there's nothing particularly complicated that happens in the exchange. That's the far majority of actual touches. So that's lesson number one, is plain playing. Now, lesson number two is timing, because timing is arguably the second most common thing that happens, which is that the opponent changes something, and I hit the opponent when they change. So, for example, the opponent changes from inside guard to outside guard, and I hit them on the wrist when they change their guard. Or the opponent attacks me, say, makes a cut one at my left cheek, and I time them on the wrist when they come to attack me. So that is, probably the majority of touches that are not plain playing are timing. So that's the second lesson. And then we have the third lesson is slipping the leg, because that is one of the most important principles in Highland Broadsword, is that if the opponent goes to cut the leg, you shift your front foot back or slip it, which means that you dodge the attack, and you hit the opponent simultaneously. Slipping the leg is a defining concept in regimental Highland Broadsword. So that's the third lesson. Now, the next lesson is an exception to the idea that things go from simple to more complex, because the next one is slipping the body, and slipping the body is really one of the most difficult techniques to actually pull off in a real bout. And this was known during the era of the Highland Broadsword manuals when they were first being published. The manual that people call the Taylor Manual, the author of that actually discourages students from trying body slips if they're fighting for their life. I don't remember his exact phrasing, but he says something to the effect of, like, look, I'll show you how to do this, but please don't try this if you're fighting for your life. It's not worth the risk. So the body slips are what's known among martial artists as a low percentage technique. They are, um, they're not as reliable and they're not as safe as higher percentage techniques. So why did I include it at this point in the lessons? Well, it's because they come right after leg slips, so there's a logical connection there. You've learned leg slips, and next you learn body slips. So when you are working on the body slips lesson, be aware that it will take a lot of practice before you can successfully do a body slip and about. And even in the era of using the broadsword, it was not considered a great idea to do that if you were actually fighting with sharps. Now, after the body slips lesson, we have double attacks. So say, for example, making a cut 1 and then a cut 2, or a cut 1 and then a cut 4, a cut 2 and then a cut 3. So with those techniques, it's important that the second attack create opposition against the opponent's most likely riposte. So for example, if I make cut 1 and then I follow it up with cut 4, the angle of my blade in the cut 4 will stop the most likely riposte from the cut 1. So after parrying cut 1, the opponent is likely to counter with a 2, or to riposte with a cut 2, or to riposte with a cut 4. And if the opponent does either of those things, my cut 4 will at least protect me from the riposte, if not actually land and cut the opponent. So this reduces the inherent risk of double attacks, which is that the opponent will time you on your second attack. So then after double attacks, we have feints, because a feint is conceptually very similar to a double attack. Of course, the footwork is different. When you're doing a double attack, you might lunge the first cut and then remain in position for the second cut, or you might lunge the first cut and traverse the second cut. But with feints, the standard procedure is that the lead foot does not move at all on the feint, and then you lunge the actual cut. Well, there are exceptions to that. There are, for example, you might appel on the first cut and then lunge on the second cut, but the basic version is not to move the front foot on the feint and to lunge on the actual cut. So feints, of course, are deceptive. They're an attempt to mislead the opponent. So the lesson that comes after feints is invitations. Now, the way I understand the invitation is that I don't believe that an invitation is particularly likely to work if it's really obvious to the opponent that you're trying to bait them into making an attack right this second. So the way I tend to think of the invitations is, you're fighting, if you're choosing to fight with an invitation, you're choosing to fight for a protracted period of time from the invitation, so that the opponent really doesn't have any choice except to come in and try something. So for example, the invitation that's shown in this version of the lessons, you invite from an outside guard by lowering your sword, and if you just stay down there with your sword lowered for a protracted period of time, the opponent will be more or less forced to attack at some point, and that's when you'll apply a timing attack or possibly a parry riposte. And, that'll be, hopefully for you, successful in the end of the fight. So after invitations, we have actions on the blade. And there are multiple actions on the blade. This lesson only shows one of them, which is bearing. And bearing, therefore, is just an example of an action on the blade. It's not the only type of action on the blade that you can do. And that has implications for all of the other lessons, which I'll get to in a moment. So in bearing, you cross blades in the outside guard. Once the blades are crossed, you then lunge, which your body mass coming forward on the lunge causes your blade to push the opponent's blade down. And then you pull back out of your attack while draw cutting the opponent's arm. Or you also could cut the face or the throat or the chest. So the action on the blade is the act of pushing their blade down with yours, and that's bearing. Okay. Now, other actions on the blade include battering, which is where you just bash their sword down by hitting their sword with yours and then hit them. And the glissade, which is this kind of corkscrewing motion with your blade against theirs that ends in a push cut to their face or to their throat. And those alternate versions of the lessons will be filmed probably next spring, because unfortunately we're now at a point in the year where we can't do any more. We can't film any more videos because the time that I meet with my students is too late in the day and the sun is setting by the time we're trying to film. So it'll be spring before I make any more videos, but at that point, I'm going to make videos that show alternate versions of all of these lessons. The alternate versions will show other actions on the blade, other examples of what can be done in plain playing, other examples of how to time an opponent, the other body slips, because this version of the lessons just shows one of the body slips, so the other lessons will show other body slips. So the thing I want you to understand about these lessons is that they don't represent the way to do the lesson. Each of them is just an example of a way to do the lesson. And you should think of the lesson as a concept, not as a specific technique. So it's not that plain playing is cut 1, parry 2, cut 3. Plain playing is any exchange where you're just cutting, thrusting, and parrying. You're not using the feint, you're not timing, you're not doing anything complex. Timing is not simply the specific example of timing shown in this lesson. It's any time that you attack while the opponent is changing something. So think of the lessons as simply examples, and we will create more videos that show more examples for each of the lessons, although the lessons themselves will be taught in the same order. So now, after actions on the blade, we have commands, which is our word for close distance grappling techniques. And the command that's shown here is a simple one. I call it the grip, and it basically just involves parrying with the sword and then grabbing the opponent's wrist, yanking the opponent's wrist down towards your hip, and that takes the opponent off balance, and then you're able to either kill them or compel them to surrender. I mean, if it was a fight with sharps, I mean. And then the final lesson is the counter disarm. And the counter disarm is when the opponent attempts a command against you, but they attempt it from too far out. A command can only be done successfully from the distance at which your blades are crossed about halfway up, also known as close distance. If you are in close distance, or with the blades crossed halfway up, or at the half sword, as we sometimes say, if you're in close distance, you can attempt a command. You're close enough to attempt a command. If you're not as close as that, you cannot safely attempt a command, and the counter disarm shows why. When the opponent comes rushing in to try to get a command, you just shift back and thrust, and the opponent will run right up your blade and impale themselves. So the counter disarm trains you in how to do that. If the opponent tries a command from too great a distance, you just shift back and thrust, and the opponent will impale themselves. So that's the 10 lessons. It's plain playing, timing, slipping the leg, slipping the body, double attacks, feints, invitations, actions on the blade, commands, and counter disarms. And any other version of the lessons that shows the same principle is a valid version of the lessons. The version that I'm showing here is designed basically just to be easy to memorize, because memorizing a set of 10 lessons is a requirement in the online program, because it is what you need to do to be able to teach the system to beginning students. But I don't want you to ever think of these lessons as simple choreographed lessons that are just done in one particular way. I want you to think of them as principles, and you need to practice multiple methods of applying each lesson, multiple choreographed versions of the lessons, and also some non-choreographed versions of the lessons. As you will see in the bouting exercises, it's possible to practice the lessons in a non-cooperative context. So that's how I want you to think of the lessons, and that's why the changes to the lessons have been made. I hope you find it useful, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.